that GM food is the most tested in history. There's loads of science backing up its safety, and the scientific bodies around the world support all the science. So I want to deconstruct that a bit, and I'd just like to say that the International Food Regulatory Body Codex developed this concept called substantial equivalence, which means if a GM crop is substantially equivalent to a non-GM crop, then it's safe and it's all fine. There's actually no definition of what substantially equivalent means, and in fact GM corn that had 44% of its amino acids that were different from the non-GM corn was considered to be substantially equivalent. A report by the Royal Society of Canada said the concept of substantial equivalence is scientifically unjustifiable and is being used to mean that GM does not undergo rigorous scientific assessment. Okay, so what happens in Australia? Our food standards body, FSANZ, does no testing itself of any GM crop. It relies on the data given to it by the GM companies. It requires no animal feeding studies to have been done, and it has passed for approval every single GM crop application that it has received. So, but when you look at FSANZ's reports, as you can do online for each of the GM crops that they've recommended for approval, you can see that some of the companies do put in feeding trials, and they range from animals being fed one dose of a GM protein and observed for between 7 and 14 days to up to sort of 90-day feeding trials. And that's really the limit of it. But also, interestingly, what some of these studies look at are things like the weight of the chicken breasts, or the tenderness of the lamb chops, or how much feed it takes for animals to reach slaughter weight. Now, as you've probably noticed, these are not of interest to us. What they are of interest is to farmers, so that they know they can feed their animals and they are going to reach slaughter weight. Okay, you say, but there must be a huge amount of studies out there that show that GM is safe, and you've all heard about, there's a great big list of studies. So I will go through a few of them in case you've heard of them. There's the Nicolia, which has 1,700 plus studies that apparently show safety, and the GMO Pundit, which has 600 plus studies. However, most of those studies have got absolutely nothing to do with safety for us. Once again, they're things like animal production studies, and also some of the studies actually show harm, and some of the published studies that show harm haven't been included in these lists, so it's a peculiar list. But then you're told, oh, the EU did 10 years of studies and it shows that GM is safe. What the EU did, it spent something like 400 million euros discussing how they should do safety assessments on GM. They didn't actually do a long-term feeding trial. There are 5 feeding studies in that review, none of which are on GM crop that we're eating, and some of which show harm. But then you probably say, oh well, there is the Van Eenman's review, which analysed 28 years worth of animals being fed and slaughtered, 100 billion animals, and they looked at, feeding animals before GM and after GM. But 98% of that study, which isn't really a proper study, it's just looking at slaughtering of commercial animals in the US, 98% of those were broiler chickens. So, I mean, what relevance? Who was slaughtered at 49 days. Now, chickens can live up to 7 years, and sometimes even longer, so it's kind of completely irrelevant. Nobody knew how much GM those animals were eating, and it was just going to slaughter yard, so there wasn't any analysis of, how healthy the animals were. There was also the Snell review that had 12 long-term feeding studies and 12 multi-generational feeding studies. But when you look at that, once again, what you find is they're looking at things like cows, chicken, fish, and sheep, all of which have completely different digestive systems to us, so that they're irrelevant. And they're considered things like a cow study fed for 25 months is a long-term feeding study, but cows live up to 20 years, so this is about the equivalent of 8 years for a human. And regardless of that, half of the cows were removed and replaced during the studies, and really no one knows why. Okay, so that's really the overall big studies that have been done. And then finally you say, yes, but reputable scientific agencies have said this GM is fine, so it's all okay. But when you actually look at the details of what they've said, they will say things like GM crops have to undergo a pre-market assessment, and nobody has appeared to have been badly affected by it. But they will say things like, but then there's been no studies and there's no monitoring. And then you have people like the Australian Medical Association saying, we would like to have a monitoring system set up so if we think that our patients have been affected by GM food, we actually do have a place to report it. So, and other scientific bodies note the huge gaps in understanding and the limited knowledge of what's going on. And I'd just like to finish by saying we've all deal with computer programs in our daily lives, and we know how frustrating they can be and how they crash and everything. Think about it like this: computer programs are written by humans, they're fully tested by humans, and even then when they go out in the public, it's only when everyone starts using them that all the bugs come to light. Now compare that with altering the genetic code of life that has been going on for billions of years. Humans did not write that. We haven't even got to the very beginning of understanding how it works, and yet we have got genetic engineers basically going out and biohacking our food. And one software engineer heard about that. He said it's like taking strips of computer code from your toaster oven and sticking it in a jumbo jet and expecting it to fly okay. And basically what we are being asked to do is get into that jumbo jet every time we eat and trust that everything's all going to be okay. So thank you.
Thank you all for coming out on a chilly Melbourne evening, and it's great to be in the company of Mariam and other esteemed panellists. It's always a pleasure to speak to people about these issues because I think they're fundamentally important to our future, not just here in Australia but globally. I guess I'd like to talk about three things briefly. One is to touch on this theme of colonialism and a colonised food system. The second one is to look at GM in the context of a colonised and colonising food system. And then this question of solidarity, because I think that's really the important topic for tonight, is how as we in a country like Australia can act in solidarity with Mariam and her colleagues as part of the food sovereignty movement in Africa that are trying to resist this colonising imperialist agenda to take this technology that's not wanted and desired, as Mariam said, into African countries. So the question is sort of colonialism. I think in Australia we are a colonial country. As non-Indigenous Australia, we have a very brief history of 200 years, and we tend to think that that history is past. It happened in 1788 and maybe through the 1800s, but it's over. I think that's a mistake. I think we very much still live a colonial reality in this country as non-Indigenous Australians, and that's really something that I think all of us need to reflect on. And as I've travelled and grown older and perhaps a bit wiser, I'm realising that it's an important thing for me as a European Australian to come to terms with what that means, how to live in this country, and really at a personal level but also at a cultural and societal level to embark on a genuine process of reconciliation and healing with our Indigenous brothers and sisters, because I don't think that we've done that. And the fact that we still have things happening like in Western Australia with the dispossession of 15,000 Indigenous people from their communities and homelands in the Pilbara is very much a reflection of the fact that this colonial reality in Australia is still very much present. And as Bob said, I was just in the Middle East in Palestine for a couple of weeks, just got back on Monday, and there the colonial reality is very stark and very present. Has anyone been to Palestine or Israel? It's, I guess a lot of us know through news media, what's actually going on there, but being there and seeing it face to face and seeing that, how that colonial reality plays out and how there are different sets of roads and different sets of laws and different allocations of water and land and economic opportunity and life opportunities for different people solely on the basis of their ethnicity and their race is really quite shocking and disturbing. And talking earlier with Mariam about South Africa and the era of apartheid, in many ways in Palestine it's even worse and more entrenched and more oppressive and more racist. So it's another aspect of solidarity for us all to become aware of these things and how they are so oppressive for a people, the Palestinians, who have suffered so much for so many years, with again the complicity and support of our governments here in Australia. And there's it's not for tonight's discussion, but there's a very powerful international movement called BDS, Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions, which has a toehold in Australia, particularly in Sydney, but it hasn't really got off the ground yet in Melbourne. And I think maybe that's a conversation for another time. But genetically modified foods, I think for me, in terms of the global food system, that again is very much an agenda of imperialism and colonialism, and it's driven by the sole criteria of profit and money making and accumulation of capital and expansion at the expense of the well-being and long-term integrity of environments all around the world where this technology is most apparent. We see it in the United States with over 90 million acres of genetically modified corn, and I don't know if anyone's seen graphs, but that started in 1990, and there's been a corresponding increase in the amount of herbicides that have been applied to that crop, with devastating consequences for the waterways in the Gulf of Mexico. I'm sure you've all heard about the dead zone of the flow of pesticides and chemicals into that part of the Atlantic Ocean. I was in Argentina last year, and there's a part of South America in the southern countries, Brazil, Paraguay and Argentina, called the Green Desert. And I'd read about this again in a book. I don't know if anyone's been to Argentina or Brazil, Paraguay. They call it the Green Desert because there is millions, tens of millions of acres planted to one crop, which is genetically modified soy, which is used to feed the factory farmed chickens and pigs in Europe and China. And the reality that became apparent to me, I flew into Buenos Aires. The next day I got on a plane and flew north to the northern city of Tucumán, which is about an hour and a half by plane. So that's from Sydney to Brisbane, that kind of expanse of land. And looking out underneath the plane, you could see nothing for most of that distance apart from a single crop, a single green desert. It's very, very stark. And the social consequence of that is dispossession, depopulation of rural areas. You have clearances, huge loss of grasslands and deforestation. And then, of course, it's all Roundup ready soy, so it's all sprayed by air, so you have crop dusters going over by air. The rural communities are forced into the shanty towns on the edges of some of the big cities. And because it's all being sprayed by air, and because the buffer zones, the enforcement of those standards is very lax, and I saw this on one side of the road, you will have the plantation, the crop. On the other side, you'll have the shanty town. You've got the planes going over the top, and they are poisoning, they're literally poisoning the people living in those towns. So you see huge spikes in cancer and birth defects and skin lesions. There's a great photo essay that was published at the beginning of this year called Argentina, the country that Monsanto poisoned, which documents the travesty that this represents. 70% of the arable land of Argentina, which is a sizable country, it runs 5,000 kilometres north to south, it's not a small country, is now devoted to genetically modified soy. And it just perpetuates a cycle of misery and suffering and death. Have I run out of time? One minute. So that is the dystopia. That's the end point of an agricultural system that's hugely dedicated towards genetically modified crops and the whole industrial profit-driven system that goes with it. But it's not necessary. Its justification, legitimation is that we need this technology to feed the world. They say that we've got this growing global population, and how are we going to feed it if we don't embrace these new technologies with their higher yields and higher productivity? Well, that is a great big myth and a set of lies. There's really been a lot of studies and research from the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights across many other fields of expertise to show that agroecology and working in harmony and sympathy with local climates and bioregions, and based on rescuing the best forms of indigenous and traditional knowledge and combining them with modern methods and adaptations is more than capable of feeding us all well. And in fact, in terms of how much food do we need, if we took out the waste and the diversion of grains to biofuels right now, we would have enough food to feed 11 billion people right today. So this whole legitimation for GM food is just a pack of lies. And I think that goes, finally, this theme of solidarity, that if we're going to change this and expose these lies and work to transform the food system, we need to be working together in solidarity, to having these kinds of conversations, to becoming more than consumers, to becoming engaged, active citizens, to taking a stance not only in reshaping our own food systems here in Australia, but working in solidarity with activists and campaigners like Mariam and the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, to support their struggles and also worldwide. So, thank you. Appreciate it.
So, I was going to mention a few things about these GM researchers, and then I'll go on to talk about the GM Free Australia Alliance. So, when I first got involved in Australia, it was in 2003, and at that time TJ Higgins, who we've heard about before, he's the one who's currently working on the GM cowpea, he was working away on the GM peas. And it was quite a source of celebration for us when we realised that the GMP project actually folded in 2005. The reason that it did was that they did a thorough safety assessment.
Can we hear you over this way too?
All right, sorry. They did a thorough safety assessment of the GMP, and they found that it caused lung lesions and inflammation in the mice that it was fed to, and also significant immune responses. So, of course, that kind of testing doesn't happen with the food that is in the supermarkets and the shops right now. We're eating it, again, often without our knowledge. But we were glad to see that there had been some rigour in this testing. And actually, at that time, Professor Higgins said that that GMP DNA was never to be seen on the planet again, and that it had been destroyed. So it was also fed to pigs and poultry, and it caused digestion problems. So then TJ Higgins turned up in 2008 in Europe. So that project was folded, and he was working on a study to cast doubt on the use of rodents for the safety evaluation of GM crops. So again, we see anything that casts GM in a negative way, there's usually a follow-on study which questions that, and we've seen that very much over the last few years with Cerulini, for example. So over 3 million euros were spent to establish this GM SA food safety program. So again, that was another little project. What I say often when I'm speaking publicly is GM has one use, and that's a use for the research scientists who can attract funding then for their latest little brainwave. TJ Higgins is also a GM activist. He wrote, for example, to a group of GM-free chefs and said that tests have not found any connection between health problems and GM. This is, of course, in spite of his earlier study on the GMP. And then, of course, I discovered only when I was visiting Europe at the GMO Free Regions Conference that this new GM cowpea was being promoted. And he's saying to the rural media anyway that this GM cowpea will be in farmers, their plan is to have it in farmers' hands in 2017. So once again, we've seen, all of us who've been involved for a while have seen this pattern where they make extravagant promises about how quickly their GM technology is going to be available. So I suppose you could say that he's a GM activist as well as a scientist, and he has naturally been able to fund his research for some time using his connection with GM. If you want to find out more detail about this, there's a great article by Kath Wilson called The Curious Case of CSIRO's GM Field Pea. So again, you could almost call it a monster, because it's showing itself once again based on this research which we assumed would fold in 2005. So the GM banana, I'll leave that to Adam to talk more about. But what happened after people realised that a GM banana was being grown in Innisfail, it upset people very much, particularly in far north Queensland, because they feel quite isolated from the rest of the country, and they felt as if their area was almost, landed with this project. Could they get support from all of us? And so when I talked more to Adam about the immediacy of the problem and the fact that it was being worked on right now by Professor Dale, we decided to work more closely with the Far North Queensland groups. I actually had messages via Facebook, people saying, I'm never going to eat a banana again unless it's organic. People are really worried when a GM project starts which relates to a food that is very important to them. But it was good to see that the Far North Queensland activists all got very motivated, and when Professor Dale spoke recently on, there was a particular... Eco Week. He spoke publicly in Cairns, and there was a lot of opposition there. There were people with placards in the foyer. There was, and I worked with Mariam and her other international contacts to do a media release about the fact, explaining all about the students and the fact that there was international opposition to this project. So I think that's, I suppose, an example of how an alliance of groups can work really productively, because I know that we'll work again with those people in Innisfail, and that was quick. And I'm hoping, that again, and Mariam coming right now will help, again, make them feel supported. And Adam, I hope you'll mention the amazing song that was written by the former Vegetable Sound System.
So many things to share.
That's right. But about the Alliance, so we link together the groups in Australia, but also we link to the new group in New Caledonia and also New Zealand. And so we have regular phone link-ups where we discuss the pressing issues of the time. And one thing that we do is try and oppose any new GM research, and the slogan we use is just turn off the tap, turn off this money that's going to projects which aren't really, there's no demand for these projects in the same way there's no demand for GM food. So we work a lot with that, and we were excited to see for the first time a really good project in South Australia, which is a GM-free state, which is called New Horizons, which you can also Google, and that's actually looking at soil productivity and soil diversity without using any chemical inputs. So it shows that there is research out there which will have a lot of importance, I think, for farmers in the future. And just one little plug, this is the sponsored link. The next project we're going to be working on is a new version of this, which is a little shopping list for people who want to favour the non-GM products in the supermarkets and the health food shops. And we're going to be launching the new version of this list on World Food Day, the same week that AFSA is working on. So that will be on the 17th of October. And if anyone would like to help us with this, we're all working on it together, but it's quite a bit of work to contact the products. And we're also asking anyone who's got a favourite GM-free product, which is labelled that, to take a photograph of it and send it to us, and then we can add it to the list. So that's me.
Our governments, our health ministers have agreed that a process should go on which will remove the labelling probably next year. A bit behind schedule, but then they will be gearing up to treat our tropical fruits and vegetables ostensibly to eliminate fruit fly, but it also decreases the nutritional value, sterilises the fruit, and really our view is that this highly processed product will still look fresh, but will be, as I said, exposed to radiation. Not made radioactive, but there are radiolytic products created in the food as well. So this is a campaign that I'm personally passionate about. I'm working with the Food Irradiation Watch group in Brisbane, and if anybody wants to know more about it, please sign on before you leave. Put irradiation, and I'll put you on our list for communications about that as well, because it's a major assault on the quality of the conventional food supply. Of course, organic will still say absolutely no way will our food supply be irradiated, but for the general mass of people out there that are buying what they think are fresh fruits and vegetables, very soon they'll be buying them irradiated. So that's my little spiel for the evening. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the song, Linda. And I think Monsanto's years are numbered because Neil Young has just released his whole album and doing this whole big tour, the Monsanto years, which is kind of an epitaph, I think. So someone told me Neil Young's got reach, which is really true. And closer to home, we've got Formidable Vegetable Sound System, this great permaculture-based band, and they wrote us a song for our GMO banana campaign called, very simply, We Don't Need No Pirate Banana, which is reached to Africa and Latin America and all over the place, and translated into a number of languages. And Charlie's working on the full version in the studio at the moment, including he's doing a kids album, so he's going to be teaching permaculture to the kids, using music, which is really great. Bob's right. Last year I helped organise Dr. Van Dandershee's speaking tour in Indonesia. That was catalysed because some of the Indonesian farmers in Kediri in East Java had been jailed and prosecuted and jailed for exchanging seeds and producing seeds, which was later then challenged by some NGOs working with the farmers and overturned in the Indonesian constitutional courts, which said that the farmers and peasant farmers in Indonesia should have the right to produce and share and exchange seeds. So bringing Dr. Shiva to Indonesia was to kind of celebrate that victory with the farmers, and also to make sure that that victory was consolidated, and so the work we've been doing there has carried on from that. But when we actually went to visit the farmers in Kediri, they served us bananas, and Dr. Shiva, although she'd had no sleep, so I don't know how she was functioning, but she got very excited about the bananas, because they were these bright orange local bananas. And she said to us, "Oh, this banana, GMO banana from Queensland, they're so excited because they've got a tinge of orange in the banana, and here these bananas are bright orange, they've got beta-carotene in them." So you have to tell people that we've got these bananas that are high in beta-carotene, we don't need GMOs to do it. So after that, I started looking into the GMO banana from Queensland. It's funded by the Gates Foundation from QUT. And James Dale is a really good kind of person to have as a campaign opponent, because he keeps putting his foot in his mouth. So he is very excited. He likes to pretend he's not doing genetic engineering. So he says, "Look, we just took genes from banana and put them in a banana. So everybody should accept that and enjoy our banana." And it's not really like this bad genetic engineering. He kind of says, "I'm not doing the bad genetic engineering, I'm just putting banana genes in it." So, but he doesn't say that they've got worm genes, nematode genes, and agrobacterium and all these other things in there. But when he said that, I thought, well, where did he get the banana genes from to put it in there? So when we started looking into it, it was very interesting, because we're talking here about colonizing Africa with GMOs, but going back to the beginning of the process of making the banana, it was very much a colonial way of making the banana. Nick was talking about colonization and Australia, and earlier terra nullius, the idea that there's empty land. And so when I first got inspired by Dr. Shiva, it was when she wrote a book, Biopiracy, and talked about how genetic engineering sees living things and living cultures and indigenous cultures as bio-nullius, as raw material to plunder genes and traditional knowledge, and local cultures are just things to plunder and make a profit of, and they're colonial property, and the people who've taken them from, the cultures that have taken them from, be damned. So we found that there'd been a lot of good work done in the early 2000s in the Pacific, especially in Federated States of Micronesia, where a US researcher who was doing her PhD at the University of Queensland, her name's Lois Engelberger, she was looking for why there was vitamin A deficiency in Micronesia, and she thought, well, there has to have been sources of vitamin A in the traditional diet, so she went looking for them, and then the local people there pointed her to these bananas which were not being used very much. They're very different kind of shape, they're boat shape, and they're bright red, and they're even called carrot bananas, K-A-R-A-T, because they're really like carrot, and also they're high in beta-carotene. So she was doing work to bring them back. They'd stopped, the local foods had been displaced by imported foods and by colonial cultures. So they were doing work to bring back people to grow and use these bananas in their food gardens, which was very successful. It's now a stamp in Micronesia. The state of Pohnpei in Federated States of Micronesia has this carrot banana as its state emblem. It's on stamps, and it was also very exciting in the international scientific community because they didn't know that they had these high vitamin A bananas. So that news was in The Guardian and went all around the world. Around that time was when Dale's project got interested, and they basically plagiarized and stole that. So Lois Engelberg has since passed away. She got ill, unfortunately, and has passed away, so she can't sort of make any comment on that. But what they did is they surveyed bananas that were held in the collection in Queensland Department of Primary Industries collection in Queensland from the Pacific region, and looked at their vitamin A profiles, and they took the highest one was from a variety from Papua New Guinea, Vasapina, and that's where they took their genes from, and then said we've invented a high vitamin A banana. So Nick was talking about the green deserts in South America, and that's basically the vision of genetic engineering. We talked earlier about golden rice. So when they introduced chemical monocultures of rice, they removed all the diverse things from the diet and just told everyone to grow monocultures of rice. Instead of admitting that, okay, no, we actually need diverse diets and we've got to eat biodiversity that's got all these nutrients in it. Erie in the Philippines says, no, the problem is rice doesn't have vitamin A in it, so we're going to put vitamin A in the rice. So the sell for genetic engineering is not very strong, so they have to come up with some idea that this is healthy. So now they're saying that we're going to increase the nutrients in our foods, but we already had the high nutrient varieties in the biodiversity, so it's basically just a kind of pirated. They got timed 25 best inventions of 2014 for the GMO banana. But Dr. Shiva tweeted that stealing is not a creative act. And they also said it was a miracle cure for blindness in Africa. So when we were in Germany, the African delegation there was annoyed. People were coming to Africa and saying, you're going to go blind if you don't accept our GMOs. So I think I've gone past that Friday.